No matter how much work I get done, work continues to pile up. I constantly fight with receipts from morning to night. Before I knew it, I was nearly 30. My ability to recover has slowly deteriorated. It happened while I was pondering such things on my way home from working on my day off. Seiichiro Kondo suddenly heard a woman scream and ran to the alley to see her begging for someone to save her as a portal was sucking her away. He ran and reached, and when they touched fingers, their bags were all that remained. He woke up next to the girl as the surrounding medieval bystanders cheered to the successful summon of their holy maiden. Sei took particular notice of a purple-eyed man with an aloof stare. Prince Urius offered his hand, telling the girl they'd been waiting for her. Sei, meanwhile, had accidentally been summoned as a consequence. From what they told him, this was the kingdom of Romani, home to a miasmic forest known as the Demon Forest. Miasma erupted from it once every 100 years, unleashing a plague. The only one who could purify it was the Holy Maiden. They utilized all the kingdom's knowledge to perform a parallel world summoning spell. Despite it being what they called an act of God, they apologized for involving Sei and bore full responsibility. The Prime Minister decreed they provide him with all the food, clothing, and shelter he needed. They asked the other worlder if there was anything else he desired. Hearing he could live his days out doing nothing, he thought this really was a dream. However, he still asked that they please let him work. After being a working member of society for 7 years, he completely internalized the corporate slave mentality and couldn't help answering the way he did. He stayed in a dormitory where many of the palace civil servants lived. He ended up taking a job at the royal accounting department and wondered if his skills would be sufficient in this world. Laying back, he hoped that girl was alright. Hearing knocks at his door, he'd be greeted by Norbert Blanc. Their boss had him bring Sei some documents and clothes. Norbert was quite friendly, seemingly golden retriever-like. He also thought Seiichiro was too much to say, and came to the same conclusion I did by calling him Sei. They used Arabic numerals here, and words translated automatically, so Sei was able to read with ease. He'd suddenly be approached by the dazzling guy from the other day, who asked what Sei was doing here. Sei explained he was waiting for a helmet from the Royal Accounting Department. Norbert came running towards them and was shocked to see Commander Aresh Indolark. Aresh sighed, and glancing at Sei, his eyes widened. Aresh took off shortly. Norbert had never seen the commander of the Third Royal Order up close before. He wondered if perhaps Aresh was worried, since Sei was from another world. He's heard Aresh was ruthless, but maybe he had a nice side too. Norbert explained the Third Royal Order was full of elite knights who could wield both magic and swords. Commander Indolark was in a league of his own though. Handsome, strong, and the son of a marquess, so he was from a good family. A rare prodigy who made Knight Commander at an exceptionally young age. Their boss, Helmut Samaria, showed them to the accounting department, and they'd start by having tea. Shortly, it was already time for lunch, so they went to the cafeteria. By evening, when everyone was heading out, Sei was taken aback. He couldn't believe everyone left promptly at the end of the workday. Bro has Japanese salaryman Stockholm Syndrome. Helmut told him since tomorrow was his day off, to take the time to buy anything he needed in town, and paid him promptly. The next day, Norbert took Sei shopping. The currency they used here was called rula. 4 rula was about equivalent to 100 yen, or 64 cents in real money. Sei took notice of an abacus and decided to buy it. Looking at pens, Norbert told Sei they had pens in the office. However, Sei wanted his own. He wanted a pen with magic ink that didn't need refilling, despite its expensive price. He figured he'd have to work hard starting tomorrow to save up. The next day, the co-workers stood stunned, with Sei having come early, tidying up the place. Norbert would ask if he slept well last night, and even though Sei replied yes, Norbert couldn't make sense of it with the super dark bags under his eyes. Norbert gave him a nutritional tonic to take tonight to get good sleep. Sei was then alerted the Holy Maiden was calling for him. Urius scolded him immediately for being late, though she told Urius she was the one who asked for him without warning. Yua Shiraishi introduced Urius as the kingdom's first prince, who'd been looking after her here. Sitting and chatting, Sei asked what she intended to do from here, and she firmly answered she wanted to do her part as the Holy Maiden. There were a lot of people in the kingdom suffering, and she was the only one who could help. Prince Urius would suddenly get called away with an urgent request from his father, so he left things here to Aresh. Sei told Yua that while it was fine to have some sense of justice, she should give some thought to her situation and surroundings. Regardless of the duties of a holy maiden, she was kidnapped and summoned to work for people of this kingdom. He recommended she thought well about what that meant and be certain of the conditions before she acted. She thought he was telling her to refuse, but he was only saying she should take her time to understand what was going on. After all, she had no idea the dangers of being the holy maiden, and they may not care if she lived or died, so long as the miasma was taken care of. She questioned how he could be so cold, and reasonably, he responded they didn't even know if what they were told was the truth. I'm gonna be honest, I like how logical he is. Yua started getting in her feelings, telling him she understood the two of them had completely different ways of thinking. She was going to do her best for the people of this kingdom. Typical emotional thinker. People who think like this will get you hurt with their good intentions. They need rational thinkers like Sei to lead them in the right direction. Lying in bed that night, Sei thought about how it was an adult's responsibility to offer guidance to minors, but he wasn't expecting her to listen to a complete stranger like him. The next morning, he was so full of energy, it scared Norbert. The tonic worked wonders apparently. They came from a skilled apothecary who made them for the knights. After work, Sei bought 10 bottles. Entering shop came both Commander Indelark and Vice Captain or Jeff Rhoda. Or Jeff asked what the funnel department was doing here and referred to Sei as the Holy Maiden's tag-along. He teased that despite being from another world, Sei looked like a perfectly unremarkable ordinary guy. With Sei promptly leaving, Aresh told him the Prime Minister had his eye on him. Sei wasn't sure what to make of that, but assumed the PM probably thought of him as a nuisance if he found out what he said to Yua. Helmet was surprised to see Sei asking for his next assignment. Norbert was amazed, seeing Sei get to quick work using the abacus he bought the other day. Sei wasn't worried about fatigue, because as long as he had tonics, he wouldn't get tired no matter how much he worked. He paused and showed Helmut there was something off about the budget request he was working on. The numbers were too round. Plus, the Third Royal Order submitted 3 identical requests for training costs, but the amount listed on each was different. Helmut answered they filed everything as training expenses, so it was fine. This pissed Sei off. He stopped Helmut from stamping approvals without examining each receipt carefully. Norbert assured him it was fine, but now Sei realized why they were called the funnel department. They literally acted like a conveyor belt for the Third Order. It was only an accounting department in name, when really, it was a front for the upper class to do as they pleased with national taxes. He knew there was no way things could run smoothly without a balance of income and costs, and needed to investigate how they were dealing with the shortfall of money. He told them from now on, they return any incomplete forms that had no written explanation of why. They needed to let the requesters know they wouldn't tolerate wasteful spending. Or Jeff would approach Aresh, letting him know how recently their budget requests were being rejected and returned. Hearing it had to do with the funnel department, Aresh took a stark pause. Spotting Aresh, Yua would run up to him, and Prime Minister Camille Carvada reminded her she mustn't run in the halls. She apologized, and the two made small talk about her classes. She thought her instructor was scary, but would probably be able to work harder if someone as kind and cool as him were her instructor. Or Jeff couldn't believe she was saying this about their heartless Prime Minister. Having looked into things, Sei could see all the deficits had been paid for out of the Demon Forest Countermeasures Fund of the defense budget. The Demon Forest miasma only erupted once every century. It would seem they've grown comfortable spending the money set aside for that. But if the miasma started causing damage, contaminating plants, spreading to animals and humans, that would definitely lead to a fall in tax revenue. The kingdom's coffers would bleed dry at this rate. A knight from the order came shouting, asking why they refused another budget request. They've loosened restrictions, but he still came every day to complain. Another knight came over to say there was trouble. There was an official occurrence of miasma. Sei buckled down and went harder to work, doing everything he could on his end. During a meeting, the Prime Minister read out the reports on disparity between national income and expenditures for the past 2 decades, as well as the specific amount spent by each department. On top of that, a calculation table for the total losses expected by potential miasma damage in the future. He asked Helmut about this. The knight from the other day argued with Sei again, and Camille came by, looking to offer Sei a proper position. Sei was intimidated. Camille likely had the same authority as the Prime Minister did in Japan. Camille hereby appointed Sei to assistant director of the Royal Accounting Department because of his excellent report. Both the wealth of Sei's information and his writing was impeccable. He hoped Sei would continue to serve their kingdom faithfully. Sei was sick of management. He wanted to work without responsibilities or restraints. Unfortunately, Camille took notice that he did indeed have management experience. His coworkers would later congratulate him on becoming their superior. That evening, he'd go out to buy more tonics because he ran out, and going to take another sip, his heart pulsed. He fell to the floor, and that's when Aresh would find him at the apothecary. The store owner told Aresh the royal errand runner came by today. Aresh didn't know who he was referring to until the man described the bespectacled civil servant with terrible bags under his eyes. Noticing Sei's overdose symptoms, Aresh would cast healing magic with a sweet melody. But Sei's chest suddenly felt hot due to magic sickness. It was because he was an otherworlder. The commander knew nothing good came from being involved with an otherworlder, but he didn't have much of a choice now. When Sei finally woke up, he'd find Aresh on top of him with his shirt unbuttoned. It was quite the healing process. Luckily, Aresh had suppressed his symptoms with the life force spell. Sei couldn't remember anything that had happened. Plus, given the scenario, he couldn't even think straight. The commander explained that his magic was too powerful for Sei, hence his magic sickness. From here on, he needed Sei's consent before doing anything more. At this rate, he might end up dying from getting crushed by the powerful magic. The treatment involved familiarizing the patient with the caster's magic. Though he didn't really understand, Sei didn't want to die. Mostly because of his work. This guy really needs a life outside of his job. As he accepted, Aresh took off his clothes, running his hands around Sei's body. Then, he'd kiss his patient. But this was only the emergency treatment, meaning they'd have to go all the way. Waking up the next morning, Sei felt fine, both mentally and physically. Looking at the time, he realized he was late for work. Before rushing off, he promised to thank the commander later on for saving his life. Aresh freaked out, especially considering the night they just had. While working, Sei was discomforted by the pain in his lower back. However, his mind felt clear, and he was in better shape than usual. His mind flashed back to the events of the previous night though, but he'd quickly shoved the thoughts away. Not everyone could use magic, which was why the Third Royal Order, known for their magical abilities, held so much influence in the royal palace. It finally clicked that the commander used his precious magic to save his life, and even went ahead to do something he really didn't want to do. Ayo, how did Sei repay him? By rushing out of the room the next morning without thinking, ignoring the man he spent the night with. Not even a box of sweets would be enough to thank Aresh. So, Sei asked Norbert what would be the proper way to apologize to someone of higher status. Norbert told him that at worst, he'd be locked up in prison. Luckily, Sei was an esteemed guest from another world, so he was safe. He then asked how much magic usually cost, and according to Norbert, he'd have to pay in gold coins. One gold coin was about 2.5 million yen. Holy, that's a lot, guys. Sei considered asking if he could pay in installments. During magic lessons, Yua asked Aresh why he wanted to become a knight, but he wasn't about to entertain unrelated questions. He didn't understand why the sensibilities of otherworlders were so different from theirs. Yua was a holy maiden who was clueless as to how to use magical energy. She had the crucial task of purifying the demon forest's miasma, yet she didn't have a hint of urgency. Typical teenage girl. Moreover, Aresh was pissed about the fact that Sei abandoned him for some so-called work. He would then head over to Sei's office and drag him off to meet Cyril Quelbus, director of the Magical Bureau. Aresh explained to Cyril that Sei had nearly died from an overdose and magic sickness. Going through the records, the director found it weird. He examined Yua, and she had no abnormalities. Since Sei was caught up in the summoning ritual, Aresh suspected he might not have received the blessings Yua did. So, he scolded Cyril for not examining Sei properly. Sei could see his own position. The kingdom might be taking care of him on the surface, but they'd be perfectly happy if he went and died on his own. Cyril speculated Sei had no resistance to magicules. These were a type of energy present in the air. They tended to be abundant in herbs, used as raw materials for medicine, making them likely the culprit in overdosing. But these magicules were also present in all types of food, so Sei should have shown symptoms earlier. Hearing that his meals were mostly made of vegetables, the doctor was stunned. How did he even survive off that? Well, Sei explained if he ate any meat, he'd suffer from indigestion. Now he figured it was due to the magicules. Moreover, he's always had a weak stomach, thanks to his unhealthy lifestyle and lack of sleep. He thought his indigestion was just normal. Even Cyril knew something was wrong with this guy in the head. he would cast a magical observational spell. Sei was amazed. This was the first time seeing magic while fully conscious. It was like having a CT scan. When the process was done, Arash held his hands, helping him acclimate to the magical energy. They'd have to stay like this for a while. Zero confirmed that Sei had almost no resistance to magical energy or magicules. But it wasn't completely zero. He was slowly gaining resistance. So if he focused on eating things with low levels of magicules, he would eventually be able to handle all foods normally. Till then, medicines high in magicules were forbidden. Sei argued that his fatigue went away and he felt more comfortable when he drank the tonics. But Zero told him his body didn't have the capacity to withstand something like that. The only thing that made him happy since coming to this world had now been taken from him. Sei couldn't wait to get back to work, but he didn't expect Arash to go to the cafeteria with him and fill his plate with the proper food he was to eat. Everyone else couldn't believe the commander was actually taking care of someone. Since Sei couldn't finish all that food, Arash told him to focus on the meats and grains. He needed to build up his strength. Returning to the office, Norbert comforted Sei and asked if Arash was the one he had put out for. Sei explained that the commander had saved his life the previous night, and today he'd been worrying about him. Norbert was amazed Sei didn't get punished for causing trouble for the commander. Realizing that he really could have gotten in trouble, Sei thought he needed to apologize and compensate Arash. But for now, he needed to clear up the work on his desk. He'd noticed another deliberate inflation of numbers, so he rejected the request, checking budget requests from each department, calculating necessary expenses, all while his work hours were eaten up, dealing with incessant complaints. There was barely enough time in the day for him to handle all this. If he had those nutritional tonics, he'd be able to cut back on sleep and get way more done. Realizing that the tonics were too strong, he thought about using something less potent. So, next time, he would ask the apothecary about it. Arash would then enter, looking quite upset that Sei was still working late. His rage was seething through because Sei wasn't prioritizing his recovery. The only reason he was fine now was that the commander had familiarized him with his magic. Maybe Sei wanted to do that night over and over again. Arash couldn't believe this fool was actually considering it, all because he wanted to take more tonics. Dragging him out, Sei stopped him, promising to go home and rest. He just wanted to take some work home, but the commander asking him to get changed wasn't what he expected. They'd head over to a restaurant, where Arash stuffed him with more food again. Sei then thanked him for yesterday and apologized for his rude behavior this morning. Arash scolded him for working late. He didn't understand why Sei was working in the first place. The kingdom already guaranteed his livelihood. There was no need for him to exhaust himself every day in the office. Sei answered that it was perhaps to establish his self-worth. Arash went, "Huh? It didn't even make any sense." Either way, Sei felt more at ease while working. The commander argued there was no point in him working to the point of ruining his health, but Sei was the type who couldn't help but get absorbed in things. After all, he was doing this voluntarily. However, he promised to look after his health more. Arash got really irritated just looking at this guy. There was still something he couldn't explain. About not liking the video and subscribing to my channel, because here on my Shoujo Weekly, I'm even covering the gay anime for you. Maybe I should turn this second channel into a BL one. What do you guys think? Well, if you're looking for more hour-long plus series outside of that, check out my completed series playlist on the main channel. You'll find tons of videos to listen to all day, so come on, subscribe to keep the bad thoughts away. This was the third time Arash had managed Sei's lunch. On top of that, the commander would take him out to the courtyard after eating and wouldn't let him go until the very end of his lunch. It was the same for dinner. Sei would get picked up after work, and Arash would take him out for a delicious meal and leisurely time. Even now, the commander served him a cup of tea, Sei's favorite flavor. For such a distinguished personage, Sei questioned why he was being so attentive to him. But at this rate, he wouldn't be able to finish all the work he planned, leaving him with only one choice: take the work home. If only it were that easy. Arash was waiting outside for him after work, suspecting he was up to something. But Sei made it clear he wasn't the type to waste his energy on pointless struggles. During dinner, he mentioned that he wanted to properly repay the commander for saving his life the other day. Arash didn't want anything, but Sei felt he needed to do something about this soon. Arash wanted him to spend his day off sleeping, but Sei had no plans for that. Instead, he wanted to learn more about this world by visiting the library. The commander argued that it was more important for him to get some rest. Also, he warned Sei not to take any of those nutritional tonics again. Smiling, Sei promised not to. After all, he nearly died. Arash's eyes widened, seeing his expression. He thought whenever Sei smiled, it somewhat alleviated the aura of exhaustion about him. But just after dinner, he'd catch Sei trying to get another tonic. Bro is an addict. Sei tried to explain that he was simply looking for an alternative, but Aresh wasn't buying it. He decided to order the store not to sell anything to him from now on. An abuse of power? Maybe, but it was for Sei's good. Sei would squirm in pain, suffering from a headache. So, the commander used his healing melody to relieve him. He then kissed Sei, saying this would be enough to take care of it. Sei had his share of romantic experiences, but knew their relationship was strange, even for another world. At first, he thought Aresh was the kind of man who couldn't abandon someone after picking them up. But yesterday had him thinking differently. Shaking the thought off, his mind shifted to the damage from the demon forest's miasma, which was progressing slowly but steadily. The Holy Maiden wouldn't be dispatched for some time. He wondered if purification was even something that could be done in a single attempt. Either way, he needed more information. At work, another budget request from the Third Royal Order came in. Without a second thought, he denied it. He wanted to start information gathering, but wasn't even halfway done with his work. Sadly, he'd have to put it off, as the Prime Minister requested for him. Camille wanted to know about the budget proposal he created the other day, and as he thought, Sei's mind worked in a very interesting way. While he couldn't deny his lack of knowledge concerning various aspects of budgeting, it was to be expected. Noticing that Sei hadn't asked about the Holy Maiden, Camille wondered if he wasn't worried about her. Sei, in turn, asked what Camille would do if, against his will, he was forced to go to an unfamiliar land where he met a child from his hometown whom he'd never seen before. Naturally, Camille would want to protect him if he had the means. Likewise, Sei thought the same, provided he had the resources, of course. But Yua was more valuable to the kingdom than he was, and was also under extensive protection. Camille liked that rational and cunning side of Sei. Conversations with him were truly meaningful for him, so the Prime Minister would call for him again if anything came up. Returning to his work, Sei decided to skip lunch, since he had some tea. He'd pass out in pain as Aresh walked in, thanks to the commander's healing. Aresh explained that magicules were incorporated into tea leaves upon production. From now on, Sei was forbidden from drinking anything he didn't specify. Now he couldn't even drink tea? Even on the comfy tea channel? Tough luck. During dinner, he wasn't pleased at all with what he had to eat. Regardless, thanks to Aresh, Sei got off work on time again. Still, he didn't understand what was commonplace in this kingdom, hence why he wanted to learn more. But his work hours were too hectic. He was a manager, so Aresh suggested he delegate his tasks to his subordinates. But being a manager was exactly why he needed to understand everything going on. Aresh usually left miscellaneous tasks to his vice commander, and they had no problems. Sei could see that explained why Aresh never spoke of the budget, despite how often they met. Sei felt this was all because of their difference in position and values. The noble commander Indolark couldn't understand the values of a lowly commoner from another world. So, Aresh asked why Sei had such an obsession with working. Why did he try to do everything alone, even if it meant taking tonics that threatened his life? Sei simply replied, "I work because there's work to be done." Aresh doubted that. He had heard Sei always came up with work that didn't exist, and readily took it on. Sei didn't deny it. Instead, he explained that the kingdom's finances were in dire straits. There was a need to fundamentally review and improve the current system. This was the first Aresh had heard of this. Sei claimed Aresh was indifferent when it came to financial matters, sparking his rage. The commander told Sei that his work had a negative impact on those around him. If someone in a leadership position jumped at every chance to work overtime, it flustered their subordinates and made the work atmosphere unpleasant. Those words struck Sei's heart. He promised to do his best to change, but he obviously had no intentions to do that. After dinner, Sei asked Aresh why he never brought anyone close to him to the restaurant. We'd learned the restaurant was started by a man who used to be a chef at Aresh's estate, and it was also his secret hideout. That's why he hadn't told anyone from the Third Royal Order about it. The following day, Sei's words weighed on his mind, causing him to notice that Harvey and Matthew weren't around. Even during his lessons with Yua, he kept thinking about what Sei told him. She'd call his attention, showing that she was done with the task. With this, he was sure she'd be able to handle the demon forest. Compared to Sei, she was unaffected by magicules, had magic energy, and was in good health. He felt he was comparing her to someone too weak. He ended the lesson and was about to leave when she asked him to have lunch with him. But he had plans to have lunch in the dining hall. Yua decided to head over there as well. Unexpectedly, she'd meet the commander with Sei. The three of them would end up on the same table, along with Norbert, who was dragged along. Poor guy. Seeing how Sei worked even when he didn't have to, Yua joyfully called him a corporate drone. She didn't mean it maliciously, but Sei could sense a deadly aura emanating from Aresh. Sei then got scolded for eating around the shrimps on the plate. Aresh would then explain to Yua why he was managing Sei's food. But she felt a bit sad that he couldn't enjoy the delicious meal, and while Sei claimed to be indifferent, Aresh called out his lie, stating that Sei's reaction to food he liked and didn't like was like night and day. Aresh had a look of endearment, describing how Sei really liked Suhash meat. He could tell because Sei's eyes softened when he ate it. On the other hand, Norbert asked Yua if it was true that roads in her world moved even when one didn't walk. He'd also heard from Sei that they could cross the sea and release some kind of power in their feet to cross the sky. Apparently, Sei had just been answering his questions randomly. The one thing Yua confirmed was that young girls wore skirts above the knee and showed their legs. And that was good enough for him. One of Yua's guards started accusing Sei of falling for the Holy Maiden and claimed he only came to this world because he was stalking her. However, Sei made it clear he wasn't interested in anyone younger than him. This caused Aresh's heart to sink. Sei had only just turned 30, and Aresh was 22. Seeing that he missed Sei's birthday, Norbert asked what he liked, offering to give him some tonics. Sei would have loved that, but Aresh wasn't about to let him have any. Suspecting that he was tired, Yua decided to use her healing magic on Sei, but Aresh quickly snatched him away, making it clear that he was the only one allowed to lay a hand on him. Over in a warehouse, Aresh performed some healing on Sei with kisses. He considered putting a barrier on Sei, but it would take a lot of magic energy. Sei's body would have to take all that, and then get familiarized with the magic at night. The next day, Orjef noticed fewer documents on Aresh's table. The commander had compiled a draft for their next expedition. He voluntarily did paperwork? Orjef could hardly believe it. Aresh then asked what reason there could be not to give someone younger the time of day. Now he was asking about love? The vice commander told him that people with large age gaps often had different values. Orjef wondered who the special girl was and wanted to go find her right now. Elsewhere, Sei bumped into Camille, who told him that the Holy Maiden's training was reaching the final stage. They planned to go inspect the demon forest soon. However, the Second Royal Order and the Firstborn Prince were against it. So, the Prime Minister was counting on Sei to figure out the costs of dealing with the miasma and the expenses of the expedition. The longer they delayed, the more money and time it would cost. Unbeknownst to Sei, two people slowly approached him from behind while he was lost in thought. Then, he'd get knocked out. Realizing he had forgotten to give something to Sei, the Prime Minister turned back to look for him. He thought Sei was so capable and considered giving him the authority to act independently. Camille would hear groans coming from the door nearby. Going inside, he was shocked to see Sei bruised and battered. Meanwhile, Orjef asked Aresh what kind of person he was interested in. The commander began thinking about the kind of person Sei was. A man who had no resistance to magicules, but insisted on overworking his exhausted body. He was also a picky eater who kept trying to sneak in tonics. Thinking about it now, he saw Sei as troublesome and infuriating. Still, Sei was someone he couldn't leave alone. A bittersweet feeling. Orjef was sure this had to be Aresh's first true love. Someone from the Royal Medical Bureau would come in, explaining what had happened. Without delay, Aresh would rush off to find Sei. While Sei lay in bed, Cyril tried to explain to Camille that only one person could care for him. Due to that, he couldn't heal Sei. More like, it was better for him not to treat Sei. Sei's peculiar constitution was connected to his relationship with Aresh. Cyril didn't want to blurt that out by accident and see his head separated from his body. However, the Prime Minister had heard there were those who despised Sei, but didn't feel the same way about the Holy Maiden. The doctor panicked. If he didn't treat Sei, he'd earn the ire of the Prime Minister who held peerless political power in the kingdom. On the other hand, if he went ahead with the treatment, he would piss off the highest ranking and most powerful man in the kingdom's military. Caught between a rock and a hard place, he had to buy time. Just as Camille was about to suggest another healer, Aresh burst in. Taking one look at Sei, he asked everyone to leave so he could begin treatment. That's when Camille found out he was responsible for all of Sei's care. However, the Prime Minister didn't understand why they had to leave. Cyril convinced him by saying it would take a lot of time. Commander Indolark then asked to be given an hour. Taking off his cloak, he slowly started the healing process. Cyril was relieved that he got here in time. With his constitution, Sei would have immediately gotten magic sick if he had used the necessary amount of magic needed to treat such wounds. It could have been fatal. The thought of a healer who didn't know his constitution while treating him sent shivers down his spine. Plus, there was the issue of acclimating Sei to magical energy. The best thing was to leave Sei to Aresh, and then figure out how to get through this situation. Sadly for him, Camille wasn't about to go anywhere until the treatment was done. Sei was in agonizing pain. He recalled the voices of those who had beaten him up, all because they saw him as a scoundrel who dared to have feelings for Yua. Seeing that they didn't plan to kill, he decided to wait out the torture. Once they were done, he couldn't move, and if left like this, Sei feared he might die. Aresh's soft singing reached him, and he recognized this warm feeling.
Oh!
His eyes would open to the commander's face. Although he felt much better, his injuries were still severe. That's why Aresh needed to familiarize his magical energy during the treatment. He let Sei know this would take some time, and his dear workaholic apologized to him. Hearing those words and seeing how soft he looked, Aresh felt something. Then, he would go ahead to finish the procedure. After they got dressed up, Aresh asked Sei if anywhere still hurt. Though there was no pain, Sei noticed his voice was hoarse. Seeing that he was in the palace infirmary, he figured someone must have carried him here. So, he wanted to thank whoever that was. Aresh would then notice his glasses were broken, but it was still better for Sei than not wearing them at all. He also didn't want his clothes cleaned with magic. For him, this was perfect. His memory was hazy from when he got beaten up until his treatment was over, but he would never forget their voices. Two of them were men from the Third Royal Order who kept complaining about expenses. The other was the Second Order Knight who harassed him during lunch. Cyril and Camille would then come in. Aresh seemed startled, hearing that the Prime Minister was the one who brought Sei to the infirmary. For the Prime Minister to have brought him here and to be treated by the commander of the Third Royal Order, Sei realized this was an incredibly lucky turn of events. Aresh would then ask for details of what exactly happened. Shortly after, Orjeff told Harvey and Matthew that the commander was calling for them. The vice commander thought about how these two liked to storm into the royal accounting department over expenses. This made him wonder if they had filed a complaint about it. Entering the office, they immediately sensed Aresh's ominous mood, calling them by their full names.
Look at this guy. He's gonna kill these two.
The commander asked what they were doing during the water hour yesterday. Matthew claimed they were both organizing the storerooms before afternoon training to check on their equipment for the expedition. Aresh then displayed a piece of torn cloth, believing it belonged to one of them.
That's GG's.
Instantly, fear gripped Harvey. He lied that it had caught on something during the inspection. Commander Indelark then mentioned that a high-ranking civil official was assaulted, and this said official was found unconscious in the storeroom that they were in. He had countless bruises, with his ribs and arms fractured. He was obviously talking about Sei, but they referred to him as the Holy Maiden's tag-along. Still, Matthew told Aresh that they just happened to pass by each other that day. Sei was an unbidden +1 on the Holy Maiden's summoning. Despite being so weak, various departments were wailing about him interfering with the palace accounts, cutting their budgets. There were rumors that Aresh, who barely showed interest in anyone, suddenly started having lunch with Sei and managing his meals. According to the commander, the victim tore off one of the perpetrator's clothing with a nail he found on the ground.
How the hell could these guys be so stupid?
By the look in his eyes, Aresh was fuming with anger. The knights tried to convince their commander to take their side, telling him not to take the word of a nobody. They claimed the person who found him must have been trying to frame them. At that moment, the Prime Minister entered, and hearing that he was the one who found Sei, the two knights were speechless. This was Camille's second time meeting Matthew, their first encounter being in front of the accounting department. When he mentioned that Sei nearly died, Harvey felt it couldn't have been that bad.
Oh, bruh. He just exposed himself. What an idiot.
And thus the truth finally came out. Camille let them know it was the commander who took care of Sei's treatment. Evidence of them frequently pressuring Sei regarding expenses had also been obtained. Still, they tried denying everything. That's when Commander Makovska of the Second Royal Order came in, bringing the Holy Maiden's bodyguard with him. Seeing him, Harvey and Matthew quickly threw the blame on the bodyguard.
Oh, the rats are turning on each other. Classic.
Of course, Aresh didn't care about their conflicts. He was determined to punish them all. They would end up with a 1-week suspension, a restraining order preventing contact with the victim, and a year's salary reduction and monetary compensation. It was quite the light punishment. Given that knights were rare, they couldn't be stripped of their knightly titles. Still, Camille felt the suspension was too short. Sei would think otherwise, explaining that it only served to let everyone know they had caused trouble. Cutting their high salaries as knights was good for the national treasury. Then, there was compensation for damages as well, including the medical expenses. Sei was sure to collect all 400,000 rula from the three of them. That was equivalent to 10 million yen. The Prime Minister didn't get why he wanted to settle things with money, but the only value Sei saw in them was money. Thanks to this, the kingdom had issued a statement declaring that Sei was a protected individual, and now the second and third royal orders owed him a favor. Also, the Holy Maiden's Demon Forest expedition getting moved would greatly reduce their expenses. As he gave the Prime Minister some documents to look at, Aresh walked up to him, scolding him for not taking proper rest, despite sustaining serious injuries. You'd think this guy cared more about his life, but to be fair, this is probably what we expect of Sei by now. Or Jeff was stunned, seeing his commander talk this much. After dinner, Aresh apologized to Sei on behalf of his subordinates. The guilt for not supervising them properly ate at him. However, Sei didn't expect much from him when it came to managing his subordinates. More importantly, he apologized for making the commander treat him again. This time, he offered proper payment. Not only had Aresh saved his life twice, but the commander also offered to cast a barrier spell on him. Sei extorted this money to be able to repay him. Recovery spells were normally expensive, especially ones used to treat life-threatening injuries and illnesses. Although Aresh provided treatment voluntarily, he decided to accept the payment to make Sei happy. At the end, Aresh explained that the barrier could protect the body from magical energy and magicules. With additional effects, it could even shield Sei from physical attacks. However, it required a sheer amount of magical energy, which, if used on Sei, would increase the effects of his magic sickness. So, it was better to gradually lay it over like a protective film. Sei would take off his vest and sit on Aresh's lap. Thinking about it, Commander Indalark had been doing most of the work to treat him. Right now, Sei felt it was absurd to make him do all the work. Just as he mentioned being more cooperative, Aresh embraced him warmly as he started the process. He knew Sei's first name, but he would ask if Sei knew his. Sei did, and then they'd kiss. The following day, Sei was given documents to review concerning the upcoming Holy Maiden's expedition. He'd be shocked to hear that the royal family would be hosting a banquet as a send-off for it, and Helmet would be his escort. Sei knew this was all a publicity stunt to show off the royal family leading the expedition. The goal was probably to put pressure on them and to lead nobles to get a gander at promising talent. Depending on the scale, the banquet could seriously cut into the national budget. Meanwhile, Norbert was so pumped up about this. He'd come with his mother's personal maids the next day to help Sei prepare well. He even brought some formal wear. That's when Sei recalled Norbert was from a wealthy family. As the maids began their work, all he could do was scream helplessly. At the banquet, Aresh was stunned, seeing Sei dazzle in the spotlight. While talking with his colleagues, Sei was approached by the Prime Minister. Camille thanked him for his help with speeding up the expedition. He noticed Sei was looking much brighter, and he complimented how the outfit suited him. However, Sei thought about how he was forced into attending this obnoxious gathering, but he didn't intend to waste his time. Before he could ask Camille what was on his mind, Director Zoltan approached the Prime Minister. Seeing his purple scarf, Sei recalled it was the color of the Royal Sorcery Department. Thanks to his help with the summoning spell, Zoltan boasted that it wouldn't have been possible without them. They were even being asked to participate in the purification expedition, and so he believed the kingdom was in more need of his department for their knowledge and ideas, as opposed to the Third Royal Order, who solely relied on brute force. Camille would then introduce Sei to him. Suddenly, Zoltan ran off and dragged Ist to come greet the Prime Minister. He and Sei would lock eyes immediately, and upon hearing that Sei was with the accounting department, he asked for money, but Sei would refuse. Obviously, Ist had no idea what kind of person he was. Ist then properly introduced himself. He was the assistant director at the Royal Sorcery Department. After that, he explained that their department needed a lot of funding. In other words, he wanted Sei to cough up cash for them. But Ist immediately got hit by Zoltan. Looking at the two of them, Sei could tell that Zoltan was focused on politics as a director, while Ist was focused on practical matters. He offered to consider Ist's request, but only in exchange for granting his own. Suddenly, Aresh grabbed him, shooting a fierce glare.
Oh, what's this?
Then, Yua would come running to the commander to get him. Aresh was supposed to follow both her and the king to make their entrance. However, he didn't feel a need for his presence, since this event was about the king and the royal family. In his place, Camille decided to go with the Holy Maiden. Aresh then questioned Sei about his face and clothes. Sei explained that he got the clothes from a friend in his department, and the same person brought some maids who did his makeup. But he assured the commander that the makeup was low in magicules. Still, it was making Aresh uneasy. Sei would try to get away, but Commander Indalark stuck to him like butter. Soon after, the king made his entrance, expressed concern over the miasma in the demon forest, and extolled the sacred ritual that summoned the Holy Maiden. Then, Yua would make her entrance, being escorted by the firstborn prince. Though she sounded a bit hesitant, she said she wished to do her best for everyone in the kingdom. Announcing the participants of the expedition was Urius, and he would be leading the charge. Seeing that there were far more operatives than expected, Sei was distracted, thinking about how to revise the budget. Unknown to him, his name had been called as part of the participants. When Camille told him, he was confused. Aresh thought this was inconceivable, so he decided to speak to the king on Sei's behalf. Urius would walk up to Sei, saying, "Even the frail Yua is going. Yet, a grown man like you wants to run away?" Aresh explained that Sei had no resistance to magicules. Regardless, the firstborn prince demanded that Sei go on the expedition. Camille would also speak up, letting Urius know that if Sei went, it was tantamount to suicide. But the prince refused to listen. He probably hated the fact that Sei sped up the expedition. Sei's participation wasn't part of the plan. That was why he wanted to connect with Ist and ask a favor, although he believed it would be most efficient to see the situation for himself. So, he surprisingly agreed to go. Stunned and speechless, Aresh stared at him, almost like he wanted to ask if Sei had gone mad. The expedition was set to depart in 3 days. The journey there and back would take 6. In the precious time he had before leaving, Sei decided to visit Norbert's home. This way, he could thank everyone for the clothes and makeup they provided. Of course, he had another purpose. He wanted to speak with Norbert's adoptive father. Luckily, Norbert was happy to make the arrangements. Since the banquet, Sei had been busy delegating his work to the right people. All because of Aresh, who always dragged him out for lunch and picked him up when the workday ended. Sei's only saving grace was the fact that he brought work home and secretly drank nutritional tonics because he recovered each time Aresh cast the barrier spell on him. Having the next day off, he'd have time to finish the work he brought home. Getting back, Sei was stopped by Aresh, who demanded to know where he had gone. However, Aresh already knew he went out with a colleague, so Sei explained that he had gone to thank Norbert's family. As for the work on his desk, the commander scolded him. Slamming the table, one of the tonic bottles revealed itself, causing Aresh's fury to grow more. After being treated, Sei tried to get back to work, but Aresh refused. He advised Sei to put his health first and be more conscious of his own weakness. Sei was well aware. After all, if it weren't for Aresh, he'd die from simply breathing. Even for this world, their present relationship was strange. Aresh then mentioned he had already prepared expense summaries for the 2nd and 3rd orders. He would give it to Sei tomorrow when they depart. Aresh wasn't about to let Sei work right now for any reason. Sei asked if he had siblings, and Aresh mentioned having 2 older brothers and a younger sister. So, the unruly, handsome commander was the youngest child. That explained a lot for Sei. Although Aresh had a room in the knight's barracks, his family home was closer to the palace. That made it easier for him to live there. As for Sei, he was an only sibling. Thinking about it now, he felt it'd be better if he had a sibling. He was so busy with work, he rarely went home for Oban or New Year's. With their only son missing, Sei wondered what was going through his parents' mind. How were they spending their days? He was the only one they had. If he couldn't return, how would he take care of them in their old age? If it came to that, he hoped they'd get all the assets he left behind without a fuss. Seeing Sei's grim expression, Aresh held him tightly, singing his melody of healing. No matter how many times Sei heard it, it always sounded like a lullaby. The next morning, while looking for the carriage he'd ride, Aresh pulled Sei aside, telling him he'd be riding on horseback. The commander wanted to monitor him due to his low resistance to magicules. Sei wondered what was the point of casting that barrier on him so thoroughly last night then. He wanted to chat with the royal sorcerers while they set out. He had never ridden on horseback before, and he tried to let Aresh know it might not be a good idea due to his frail constitution. But the commander looked angry, all because Sei referred to him by his title. As everyone set out, Aresh and Sei would both be riding the same horse. Using the time, Sei started going through the document Aresh had put together. This was his chance to learn about the accounting methods of the royal order. Anything to make his work easier was always a good thing. Arriving at a lord's estate, Sei finally had some time to himself. Before he could go meet Ist, Yua would come to him, disrupting his plans. Shortly after, he met with Ist to discuss plans for raising funding for the Royal Sorcery Department. Ist was happy to invite him in. He was the type who honestly stayed true to his desires, and the kind of person whose hobbies became their line of work. For Sei, Ist would be easy to work with on a professional level, unlike one particular saintly brat. During his meeting with Yua, she begged him to switch places with her tomorrow. He explained to her that the Holy Maiden was the only one who could purify the miasma. On the other hand, he was the only person in the world most susceptible to miasma. Just breathing the outside air would weaken him. He was certain he would die. Yet, Yua was here, increasing the workload of those tasked to protect her, and asking him to risk his life. His words struck her like a dagger to the heart, causing tears to well up. Sei advised her to start considering things more seriously. This wasn't a world where she could blindly do as she was told and expect to live peacefully after. She didn't know this, but he planned to ruin her brilliant future as a holy maiden. Later on, Aresh heard about what he told Yua, so he made sure it wouldn't reach the king's ears. During the dinner party, Yua was visibly down thanks to Sei, but the fact she still came meant she must have given his words some thought. If the Holy Maiden had skipped the Lord's dinner party while staying at his estate, it would have been a great insult to him. As expected, Urius covered for her, saying she was tired for her journey, as he thanked the Lord for his hospitality. At first, Sei thought Urius was blinded by infatuation with her, but it seemed he needed to reevaluate his opinion of the prince. Holding Sei tighter, Aresh remarked, thinking Sei had no interest in the Holy Maiden. He could see he was mistaken. Sei definitely had interest in her. This made Aresh's heart clench. Afterwards, Sei figured it was about time for the commander to return to his quarters. But Aresh wasn't going to leave until he stopped working. He put his head on Sei's shoulder and asked him where he went before dinner. Sei figured he already knew about him visiting Ist. The commander complained about the way Sei always ignored him or postponed things with him while he was working.
Oh man. He wants Sei's attention. I get it.
Knowing what he said was true, Sei still tried to deny it. Upset with him, Aresh snatched his documents away and held him tight as they lay down. On the third day of the expedition, they finally approached the demon forest. As the carriage tripped, Yua began to panic. She had heard some animal noises, but her guard assured her that the knights were here to protect her. They wouldn't be outdone by any kind of ferocious beast. She offered to help with her healing magic, but it was best for her to remain at ease. The purification was all she needed to think about. Despite hearing about the miasma, everything had been so tranquil for her. Everyone protected her, so Yua lived peacefully. But she'd be very much worried for Sei, especially after recalling what he had told her. Meanwhile, Aresh and his comrades took out the beasts that were attacking. While Sei was taking notes, he'd be protected by Aresh. Arriving at the entrance of the demon forest, they would all proceed on foot from here. Civil officials were to wait, except for Sei. Urius wanted to drag him into danger no matter what. Sei thought about staying behind, considering Ist was here as well. But Ist couldn't even remember the favor he asked for. With no other choice, Sei agreed to go. Aresh scolded Sei severely. Regardless, the ultimate goal of this expedition was the Holy Maiden's purification. If her mental state became such that they achieved no results, it could be a huge financial loss. Sei couldn't rest easy until he verified things with his own eyes. Arriving at the source of the miasma, Yua began chanting her spell. In the middle of it, a sharp pain struck her, causing her to pass out. But Urius would catch her just in time. Then, Sei asked Ist how far the purification had gone. Hearing that it was just 30%, it meant they would need to organize at least 3 more expeditions. Considering how hefty the costs were, he was hoping to do this in one go. Looking at Yua, he could tell she was at her limit. The commander would come by, scolding Sei for leaving his side. Sei explained that he asked Ist and the Royal Sorcery Department for a favor, but Aresh claimed his Third Royal Order had more experience when it came to magic. As Sei explained that they were short on manpower, Sultan stormed into the conversation, demanding an explanation. He hadn't heard a single thing about this, because Ist didn't even bother to tell him. Calming the director down, Sei told him that they needed people highly practiced with magical energy and magic studies, which could only be handled by the Royal Sorcery Department. Of course, there would be special compensation for the job. Sultan doubted a mere assistant director of accounting could decide this, but Sei assured him that his director and the Prime Minister had already signed off on it. His plan was to have Zoltan, who was always eager to be in charge, instruct the others while Ist would select members more resistant to magicules. Before he could give out orders, Urius would interrupt him, asking who gave him the authority. Sei responded it was the Prime Minister, and he had a letter entrusting the matter to him. The prince argued about being in charge of the expedition. However, Sei told him this was a separate affair, and advised him to get Yua somewhere to rest. Surprisingly, she wanted to stay with Sei. Maybe she finally realized the dangers of this world and the precariousness of her own position. Unable to do anything for her now, Sei would ask her to return to town and get some rest. As she left, the prince still questioned Sei on what he was about to do. He seemed to be strongly motivated about the miasma. Sei then asked him to stand back with his guard to observe at a distance. As for the knights, they were to protect the members of the Royal Sorcery Department and record the details of the barrier they cast. Sei's plan? To protect the kingdom. Urias and Aresh stared in awe. It was preposterous. Barrier spells were a complex form of magic that only a select few could use. A barrier large enough to cover the entire kingdom would require far more sorcerers than they had. Zoltan confirmed this, saying they only had 8 here who were capable of casting the spell. Nevertheless, Sei claimed they only needed to think of it the other way around. Knowing the root of the miasma, they just needed to shift their perspective and seal it at the source. The sorcerers would then surround the tree and begin their chanting. Following this, Sei and Aresh analyzed the plan. The barrier would be cast approximately 3 meters in radius around the tree, after which they would determine the concentration of miasma inside. Then, they'd plant various flora around the area to determine how long it would take for the barrier to weaken. In the end, once the Holy Maiden finishes the purification, they'd cast the barrier again, station guards around the forest, and have the spell reinforced regularly to prevent any miasma leakage. Aresh was left speechless. He had never considered something like this until Sei showed up. Sei figured it was probably due to the Holy Maiden. Few bothered to consider other, more time-consuming solutions when an easy one was available. But with this method he had come up with, there would be no need to summon Holy Maidens from other worlds again. The kingdom could take care of its own problems. Granted, the Holy Maiden was a symbol of hope to the people, and an ace up the kingdom's sleeve. Convincing the king that one was no longer needed would take more work. As Sei stood up to get more work done, Aresh dragged him back to bed. Not again. He'd been exposed to miasma today, so it was time to reinforce the barrier. Even the knights with high magical resistance were feeling unwell. Yet, Sei was fine, thanks to the barrier. He couldn't tell when it started, but he had grown aware of the commander's feelings. As Aresh slipped his hands into Sei's shirt, he tried to stop the commander. He didn't see the need for this, especially since only physical contact was needed to familiarize him with the magic, not acts of pleasure. Suddenly, Ist walked in on them. Oh, well, that's awkward. Staring at him in the most threatening way possible, Aresh commanded him to leave. But Ist remained. He recalled sensing the commander's magical energy from Sei back at the banquet. It was odd for someone with no magical resistance to emit another's energy. Seeing the situation, Ist's curiosity was satisfied. Or so they thought. With an oblivious expression, he'd stupidly ask, "Can I stay here and watch?" This guy is like my viewers. Fed up with them, Sei pushed both Ist and Aresh out of the room. Being in a place with less miasma, he made it clear he was fine. He still needed to organize some documents and mentioned that he'd be riding in a Royal Sorcery Department carriage starting tomorrow. So, he and Ist could finally discuss what they wanted to talk about. With that settled, he slammed the door shut, leaving Aresh in an awkward position. The next day, while Sei was listening to Ist blabbering, he noted it had already been over 2 hours since it started. He didn't get why researchers were so single-minded when they found something that interested them. Apparently, Ist was from a merchant family rather than a noble one. He was incredibly dedicated to his pursuit of magic and highly skilled in a wide range of spells. Although he spoke about interesting topics, Sei still had other things he needed to do. He needed to report to Prime Minister Camille, make arrangements with their collaborators, as well as many more things. By nighttime, he had sent a swift notice to Viscount Blanc and prepared the documents. Now, Aresh was back in his room, trying to get him away from work so that his barrier could be reinforced. With no other choice, Sei accepted. It was true that he couldn't afford to collapse now, and Aresh was thinking about him more than he expected. Without the commander, he'd definitely be dead. Still, there were things he needed to prioritize at the moment, so he couldn't address Aresh's feelings. He'd need to think about them properly once everything was over. Aresh then told Sei he didn't plan on letting anyone else take care of him. Look at this man, he's so obsessed. I don't plan on letting anyone else take care of you. Got it? Ooh. Of course, Sei's life still depended on the commander familiarizing him with magical energy, and because of this, Arash said he couldn't leave him. This was his way of making his intentions clear, which was also the most efficient. Sei asked if the commander had ever considered that he might harbor negative feelings towards him, but Arash didn't, because he saw Sei as a man who prioritized efficiency. It was clear he valued outcomes more than the words and actions of others. He knew Sei so well, and knowing Sei couldn't give an answer now, he was going to take advantage of that. After all, it was the most efficient method. Later on, Sei would meet with the king, who happened to be Norbert's biological father, as well as the king of the Romany kingdom. The king spoke of his endeavors during the expedition, which he had read from the report received from Viscount Blanc. Urius had no idea about this. Sei explained that he became acquainted with Viscount Blanc, who worked with him in the accounting department, for the sake of the kingdom, and by extension, the royal family. The Viscount commissioned him to conduct experiments regarding the long-term effects of miasma damage. Even if Norbert was illegitimate, the king still entrusted his own son to the Viscount. It was clear how much the king trusted him. Sei also mentioned that after consulting with Camille, they concluded that they ought not unnecessarily worry the king. However, he humbly apologized for failing to report until after he had results. The spread of the miasma had been halted temporarily, though how long the barrier would last was a factor. As long as they periodically sent sorcerers to recast the spell, the blight of the miasma could be considered resolved. Some nobles fought back, claiming this was absolute nonsense. Some sorcerers would come in, distributing the financial reports, comparing the cost of summoning the Holy Maiden and all of her estimated expenses for the next 50 years to casting and maintaining a barrier for the same amount of time. The difference was fivefold. Sei's plan was way more efficient. Regardless, Urius would accuse Sei of trying to belittle the Holy Maiden with financial scheming. He claimed she was a national treasure. The nobles would join in, berating Sei. Arash was boiling with anger, ready to give him a piece of his mind. Then, Yua finally spoke up, saying she wanted to go home. She would do her best as the Holy Maiden, but once that was over, there'd be nothing left for her. So she begged to be sent back to her world. Despite the prince trying to assure her, she didn't see any reason they'd need her once the purification was complete. With her looking to Sei, he let her know the role of the Holy Maiden would no longer be needed in the future. But as of right now, there was no way for them to return to their world. Hearing this left Yua falling to her knees. She screamed out, wishing it weren't true. What about her family? She missed them. But all the foolish nobles could think about was how the Holy Maiden was vital to their world. Sei wanted to distribute the next document, but they'd blame him for putting the Holy Maiden in distress. You'd think the way they were reacting, that they weren't the ones who dragged her here against her will. Standing up, he mentioned there might be a way to send them back with further magical research. Looking over to Ist, that was his signal to come in, and Zoltan definitely couldn't stop him. He began explaining what was needed for the parallel world summoning spell, but his blabbering got to be too much. Sei would then present a proposal to expand the Royal Sorcery Department. In summary, they had decided to start a research project under the department that aimed to return 2 people, including the Holy Maiden, to their original world. Additionally, the proposal factored in the personnel required for monitoring the miasma. Camille and Arash would defend Sei from both sides, denying the nobles any chance to argue back. In other words, with Sei's proposal, the kingdom would trade the legend of the Holy Maiden for advanced magical technology. Plus, there wouldn't be additional financial burden to the kingdom. Sei could see Aresh's expression came off like, "Aren't I useful?" Like he was some big smug cat who wanted to be petted. Yua would rush to Sei, asking what she should do. Until then, he believed it was best for her to remain here until the purification was finished. And after that, she wanted to leave the royal palace and come work at the same place as him. That was the last thing he needed. So, he suggested she look for a church or clinic, which were way better suited for her. Approaching Yua, Urius would try to convince her that staying at the royal palace was better. He didn't get why she wanted to leave, but she made her intentions clear, even offering to return all the accessories and dresses given to her. With still a lot more to do, Arash asked Sei not to push himself too hard. At the market, Sei went to collect an item from a 12-year-old boy named Sigma. He was ambitious and clever, the kind of person Sei would want in the royal accounting department. As Norbert came looking for him, Sei gave him the abacus he had come to pick up. With this, Norbert would be able to do calculations faster, and Sei offered to teach him to use it. Sei's workload had only increased since the expedition. He no longer had time to double-check the accounting department's math. Arash had told him he needed to be training the next generation, and although Yua still lived in the palace, she spent most of her days visiting the church. They needed to finalize the plans for the miasma observation project before the purification was done. With that in mind, they'd have to arrange the next expedition carefully. Norbert then mentioned that his father had been promoted from Viscount to Earl. Now, he was the son of an Earl. I don't know why that matters since he's technically royalty. He teased about his connections to get a promotion, but hearing that Norbert could be his boss, Sei couldn't wait, though his expression said otherwise. Either way, he was happy to see how well his colleague was doing. Apparently, Arash had asked for Norbert when they got back from the expedition. When he returned, he looked so pale, Sei was worried. What had happened was, Arash's call was to warn him to never prepare an outfit for Sei or stay the night with him again. The commander swore to do everything himself.
ああ、聖一郎を家に泊めたり、晩餐会の衣装も用意したと聞いた。はい。今度からしなくていい。お前は何もするな。あれの世話は全て俺がする。
Dang. Arash says he wants to pick all Sei's outfits.
Getting back, Norbert tried to get Sei to teach him how to use the abacus elsewhere. But Sei quickly caught sight of knights in front of his room. Entering the room, he couldn't believe his eyes. His documents, his pen, everything was gone. Arash would show up, letting him know that he had bought a house. So, Sei was going to move in. The commander assumed Sei was in dire need of his care, and would most likely die without him.
お前も引っ越す。
Oh, look how proud this man is. He literally just bought Sei a home for him.
With them living together, there'd be nothing to worry about. They moved all of Sei's things while he wasn't there. Sei finally realized Norbert had deceived him. Arash ushered them to go there now, and despite Sei's reluctance, Arash assured him this was the most efficient way. Sei got pouty, knowing Arash was using the magic words to make him do whatever he wanted. Shortly after, they arrived at a huge mansion. The butler, Valtam, and the maid, Milan, would introduce themselves. As Arash guided Sei to his room, Sei mentioned he had never lived with a butler and maid before. However, Arash advised him to just pretend like he was staying at an inn. Getting to Sei's room, it was incredibly large, so lavish that it made him uncomfortable. For Arash, this was nothing incredible. It was just a small, simple mansion for the two of them. Sei remarked that there was a difference in values. Looking at the table, he was so happy to see his pen and documents. At least, it'd be easy for him to work here. Soon after, Arash asked what kind of place he lived in before this. Sei told him it was an ordinary dormitory-style apartment with a single room. It only served as a place to sleep. As for the kind of house he was born in, his parents lived in a two-story home. The first floor had a living room, a changing room, and a bathroom, and the second floor had 3 bedrooms. Sei's was on the southernmost side. They also had a yard just big enough to hang their laundry and futons. Arash felt it was quite tiny. Well, Sei's country was a small one without much land, so it was normal for him. Arash would take his documents away, telling him to put work on hold for today. There were more important things to tend to. Seeing that they had 3 days before the expedition, Sei told him the barrier was very effective with 1 night of casting. He didn't see any need to do it now. Despite that, Arash would push him down, reasoning that spreading the casting over 3 days would be less strenuous on him. In turn, he'd be better prepared for the expedition. Sei couldn't argue against such reasonable logic. Before the commander could get down to it, they'd hear a knock at the door. Dinner was ready. Sei was saved, but Arash was furious. From a single bite, Sei loved how delicious the food was. The cook, Pavel, was glad to hear it. He was an apprentice to the owner of the hole-in-the-wall restaurant. Meanwhile, Valtam had served Arash at his family estate since he was a kid, and Milan was said to have returned to work after raising her children. Valtam promised that he and his colleagues would do their best to improve Sei's resistance and maintain his health. He needed only to let them know if he had any requests. 2 weeks later, Sei woke up to Arash cuddling him. He questioned why Arash slept in his bed every night.
Yo. Yo. He snuck in Sei's bed and he sleeps in his bed every night. Ooh. Sei even locked the door, but the commander had a key of his own. Sei had objected many times to no avail. If he worked too late into the night, Arash would drag him to bed, even though he already made sure not to retire before midnight. Without a doubt, Sei was quite aware of what was going on. Arash was using healing magic on his magicule weakened body every night. Minor healing spells could be cast via touch. They had only gone all the way twice. The time he took too many tonics, and when he was assaulted. Given both were necessary treatments, he thought there was no way around it. At the office, Norbert thanked Sei for the abacus. Thanks to it, the calculations have been a breeze. and thanks to Norbert's big mouth, Sei could see that he could take on more work. The second expedition was now over. If they successfully complete the purification on the next, they'd have the miasma and the damage it was causing in each region under control. Currently, the kingdom was prudently allowing the Holy Maiden to rest, so there was no certain date for the third expedition yet. Nevertheless, it was bound to depart within a month. Next, Sei thought they'd need to get a budget approved to fund the research for their return home. Even after delegating his work to some of his subordinates, there was still a lot to do, and if he took work home, he couldn't get much done, thanks to his top. Still, they were making such smooth progress because Aresh was coordinating with other departments in advance. Thinking about it now, Sei realized returning home would mean leaving Aresh's side. He really needed to seriously think about things soon. Suddenly, he'd received word that Camille was calling for him. In the Prime Minister's office, Aresh questioned why Camille was sending someone from the accounting department to the church. However, the person in question, Sei, had already agreed. They took a seat, and Sei explained that he was going to the church to investigate because they had yet to submit their income and expenses report. Despite that, Aresh saw no reason why he specifically had to be the one to go. Camille saw no other person who was more suitable than Sei. Aresh pointed out that the church housed sacred relics. Several barriers were cast on them, and the magic concentration there was high. The likes of Sei had no business there, but Camille would argue that he survived the demon force without any issue, not knowing it was all thanks to Aresh. He told Aresh that as the commander of the Third Royal Order and the son of an earl, he should be more aware of his power and influence. Aresh's favoritism towards Sei was troubling. On paper, Sei was planning the miasma countermeasures on the Prime Minister's orders. But if Aresh sided with him on top of that, Sei would gain enough political power to breed unnecessary resentment. Sei would be commuting to the church for a month. Hopefully, any dishonorable rumors about the Third Order would die down by then. Sei didn't see it as a bad deal either. If he could secure the church's cooperation, they would make great strides towards the miasma countermeasures and relocation magic research. Back home, seeing how Aresh cast off his commander persona, Sei thought he looked childish. Aresh dragged him closer, and seeing that his hair was still damp, he'd use magic to help him dry it off. The commander assured he wasn't angry, but he didn't understand why Sei kept choosing to go places that were dangerous for him. The church had a special barrier around it, and above all, the act of prayer released magical energy. For Sei, it was a hostile environment on par with the demon forest. Regardless, he had no choice but to accept. So, he'd ask Aresh to make sure he was safe. 99% of the Romani people were monotheistic and worshipped the god of Abrin. The church was 30 minutes by carriage from the Romani palace. It had about 15 clergymen, even including the caretakers in the orphanages run by the church. The staff still numbered under 20. It was such a large church that it was probably safe to assume some of its operations were outsourced. Feeling nervous, Sei walked towards the entrance, reminding himself that Aresh had applied a very thorough barrier. He'd meet Celio and introduce himself, but the kid had no plans of helping the old man. Dang. Sei got hit with the Unk status treatment. Sei wanted to speak with a priest or someone in charge of accounting, but Celio claimed everyone was busy. Sei made it clear that he was here on official orders from the royal palace, but that didn't make a difference. He was obviously not welcome here. Celio let him know that no one here would work with him. Since he could do whatever he wanted before leaving, Sei headed to the library. Picking a book, he saw the management was terrible, so he got to work. He reviewed their income and expenses from prior years, but so much of them were unclear based on the old accounting department standards. Sigvold approached him, asking what he was doing here, and after Sei explained, Sigvold was shocked to hear this. Sei also told him that Celio asked him to do as he pleased. He wasn't given a guide. Hearing that it was Celio, Sigvold asked him to come to the reference room. He would then introduce himself as the priest here at the Romani Royal Capital branch of the Church of Abrin. He'd been away at another branch for a few days, hence he was unaware of the situation. Then he told Sei that this was where they kept important documents and literature valuable to the church. Outsiders weren't permitted to view them. When Celio came in, Sigvold asked who instructed him to meet Sei. Celio told him it was Bishop Mattius. But before uttering another word, the priest reprimanded him for not guiding Sei properly. Sigvold mentioned that certain areas were restricted within the church, but neglecting to tell Sei which areas demonstrated their naivety. Everything here was without a lock or caretaker, just like this unguarded library. Seeing him off, Celio told Sei he'd be watching him starting tomorrow, and then he stormed off angrily. Returning home, Aresh was at the door waiting, pointing out that he was late. Luckily, Sei was fine, and his mood was good too. The commander would take him, so they could take a bath. He'd also recast Sei's buried there. The last thing Sei was expecting was to take a bath together with Aresh, but here they were, He could hardly call his experience at the church comfortable, but he'd be going back the next day. After all, it was his job. Sei thanked Aresh for the barrier and promised to try to be home earlier, starting tomorrow. It wasn't just Aresh, but everyone in the mansion was worried about him. That was why Sei needed to be back safely. This time around, he wasn't alone. Celio scoffed, not happy to see Sei was back. Even being laced with Aresh's barrier, Sei could feel the stifling magicules around him today. Celio hated that Sei was increasing his workload. That should really be Sei's line though. If their branch had submitted their income and expenses report on time, there'd be no need for this investigation. Celio didn't seem to care though. He believed the church existed outside of the kingdom's authority. Sei couldn't believe this was their attitude after being designated as the kingdom's primary religion and receiving subsidies. Not gonna lie, if I was running this country, I'd cut off all funding and send their pious asses back to poverty. Sei asked to meet whoever was in charge with the church's accounting, and was shocked to learn Brother Sir Piano wasn't here. He went to a meeting in another town with Bishop Matthias. This was the second time the bishop came up. Sei knew something was fishy. He had gotten used to working at the palace, but the church had a completely different feel to it. Sei suddenly felt a splitting pain in his head, and Celio explained there was a barrier around to keep anyone from messing with the statues. Sei figured he had to be careful. Celio stood proud, ready for them to begin the next explanation. He sure liked to talk a lot when it came to matters of the church. The bell tolled throughout the entire area, signaling it was mealtime. Celio knew they had no choice but to feed Sei since he was here. But Sei was already well prepared with his own lunch. Leaving Celio to run out of embarrassment, Siegfried would find Sei working after his lunch, and the two would take a walk to the flower garden created by the Holy Maiden before the last. She said that flowers soothed the human heart, and she cared for this garden herself. Sei remembered from reading about her in the records that she became a nun on the outskirts of the kingdom. She must have settled down at this church after fulfilling her duties. Siegfried would suddenly bow before Sei, thanking him for doing his utmost with the Holy Maiden to save the kingdom. Sei assured him it wasn't so grand, that he just happened to come along with Yua as a normal person with no power whatsoever. However, Siegfried took this as divine revelation bestowed upon them by the goddess Abram. Sei wondered if this is what it felt like to have a mission unconditionally thrust upon you and high expectations placed on your shoulders. Back at the accounting office, Norbert was slacking off big time, knowing Sei wouldn't be back for a whole month. Not expecting Sei to appear behind and catch him. Today was Sei's day off, but he came to catch up on any missed work. Norbert asked if he was allowed to tell Aresh about this, and Sei grunted angrily. Norbert asked if it'd be bad if he got caught, but Sei thought it was fine. Aresh never came to the cafeteria alone. Norbert was concerned over the food Sei was picking, but Sei assured he was slowly building up the tolerance to deal with magicules. The two would chat, and Norbert explained all citizens were baptized by the church at the age of 6 and underwent a coming-of-age ceremony at 18. They even gave offerings to the church during seasonal festivals. For most people, the church felt closer than the royal palace. Nobles who own land support their local churches, while nobles who didn't have either support the one in the royal capital or the Orthodox Church. Sei thought about how he saw many noble families in the visitor logs. Apparently, a lot of positions in the church were held by nobles, so Siegfried was likely one as well. The only ones allowed to work in the church were those who graduated from the almshouse, or nobles with lots of magical energy. That's because they needed a lot for prayer ceremonies and sacred relics. No wonder Sei felt so uncomfortable at the church. It radiated with magicules. If it weren't for Aresh's barrier, he might have collapsed on the first day. Siegfried would find Sei working on his own again in the church, meaning Celio left him behind again for lunch. The two would talk about how Celio didn't seem to like Sei. Siegfried explained Celio's always had an inferiority complex towards nobles and civil servants. Sei figured if they assigned him the boy knowing that, the church must feel strongly about the royal palace. Of the monks in training, some had no families, and the majority were commoners. They instinctively rejected anyone from the royal palace. Siegfried wanted to assign Sei another guide, but he couldn't go against the orders of Bishop Matthias. The church was open year-round. Their jobs and lives here were intertwined, so they learned as they worked every day. Being raised in such a closed-off environment from a young age was bound to instill a biased set of values in them. Out by the garden, Siegfried would learn Sei had no resistance to magicules, and thus couldn't eat the food here. Holy spells and healing also had the opposite effect on him. He would see Sei as a tribulated disciple. His inability to adapt to this world was a trial given to him by God. Sei wondered if he flipped a switch. He was getting an incredible sense of deja vu from this man, like a certain eccentric experimenter. If he wasn't careful, he figured he'd get roped into monastic training. He'd later visit Ist, sleeping on the floor at the magic research department to get a progress report on the return spell. Ist's co-workers were amazed by Sei. Even they couldn't understand what Ist said most of the time, but he was rapidly taking notes. Sei learned they lacked both the manpower and funds to buy tools required for the return spell. Hearing Sei was going back to the church tomorrow, Ist wanted him to bring back a relic. But that obviously wasn't going to happen. Yua would happily catch Sei as he was leaving. Urias wasn't eager to see Sei at all though. Yua was excited to hear he'd been working at the church. She's been visiting the church as well, purifying those who felt sick. She especially loved Celio. She thought he was such a beautiful child, and thought he was a good boy who taught her all kinds of things. Both the guys were shocked hearing this. Urias told her that as the Holy Maiden, there was no need for her to work, but she wanted to do what she could. She ran off because Urias kept pestering her about it. Urias sighed, but he wasn't going to let Sei go as well. Over tea, he complained about Yua not depending on him, and instead, someone weak and powerless like Sei. Sei was quiet, thinking about how the answer was obvious if Urias just considered what led to this. He answered that they were likely drifting apart due to a difference in values. Urias didn't understand. He thought Yua was from a noble family, so their ideals couldn't be so different. However, Sei clarified the class system in their country was abolished and no longer existed. But even so, Urias thought as the Holy Maiden, she should be treated with great care. Sei answered that she was showing restraint. He assumed she probably didn't want to owe Urias anything, and didn't want others to just serve her. She wanted to return to her world, but the kingdom wanted her to stay as a political and diplomatic symbol. Urias was not satisfied with this. Sei wanted to continue on to the library to do some research, but he'd get stopped by Commander Makovska from the Second Royal Order. No one was going to let Sei just work. In private, he begged Sei to help mediate things between Urias and Yua. Sei was out though, or Jeff would watch Sei pass by and get startled by Aresh. Aresh would ask why he mentioned Sei's name, and or Jeff made the excuse that he was wondering if Sei would be joining their next expedition. He'd find another excuse to get Aresh off his back, and before Aresh left, he turned back to say no one other than himself needed to call Sei by his full name. He told Orjeff to call him Kondo, his family name. Orjeff thought about how this went beyond being protective. Aresh always put Sei first, and now they were living together. There was no doubt about it. His first love was definitely Sei. Back home, Sei welcomed Aresh returning early. He thought about how Baltam had been taking care of Aresh from a young age, practically like a father figure, and the only one who could reason with him. Since Baltam had asked him to greet Aresh with them, it must mean something. Sei didn't have the courage to ask, but he wondered what the servants here thought of him. When he finally got to greeting Aresh asked what he was plotting. Sei thought he was so rude. The least he could do was welcome his landlord home. He asked what Aresh took him for, and Aresh answered, an extreme workaholic. Sei didn't feel like welcoming him home anymore. Aresh would touch Sei's face, and his expression softened. The servants watched gleefully. Sei got so flustered, he turned away, but Aresh would turn it around by telling Sei he had the documents for the next expedition they could review. Sei sat on Aresh's lap, reviewing the documents while being embraced tightly. The two discussed how the kingdom was short on sorcerers. Most were tasked with handling the demon forest. Aresh would explain magical energy could go out of control, so children who had a lot of it were often sent to the church. Aresh suddenly began casting another barrier onto Sei, and turned Sei to face him. Sei thought he was too heavy for this, but Aresh assured him he wasn't. The two would kiss. Being called Seichiro, Sei blushed. Aresh proceeded to get on top of him, and put his hand up his shirt. He wanted to do a body check, since Sei put on some weight. The next expedition was in 6 days. They still had mountains to move. Sei needed to pull himself together, but he kept thinking about last night. He needed to stop thinking about it and focus. He knew Aresh was naturally clever, quick to learn, and had a keen sense of intuition. Instead of getting swept up in things, it was clear he was targeting Sei's aversion to wasting time, and his desire to get the most out of a situation. He thought Aresh was sure troublesome, because he had yet to face his own feelings properly. Alright, another episode in the books. A lot more plot setup, less spiciness. But I hope you still enjoy. Subscribe to keep up with future parts. But for now, watch this next video. It's me, Comfy T. I'll see you all in the next one.